If you're not familiar with the work of Helen Kerr, you may know her work in different stages of her career. Helen and I have known each other personally for a very long time. We share a birthday, and we have celebrated that for decades together. I first knew Helen through her industrial design work, and this is where she became most well known. She actually owns 40 patents for new innovations and products, both in Canada and internationally. But in not even so much recent years, but over the years, she began to expand her practice quite substantially by, first of all, introducing people from different disciplines to work on teams for projects, and then to actually get involved in work using design thinking, design solutions in a more holistic way, to the point where she's arrived now to the talk you're going to hear this evening, which really encompasses the way we live, will be living, wish to be living, cities, how they're structured, how different parts go together. I haven't heard it all, so I don't want to speak too much to it, but I will just say that it's a unique transformation. Not to say that industrial design is a limiting thing, but just to say that this particular person has the capacity to engage many people from different disciplines and actually drive things forward in a way using perhaps the design approaches that she's so familiar with, that are really going in a new direction and in something that has not been covered before. And as a result, many governments, many institutions, not just in Canada but abroad, are tapping into this and asking her to be a consultant to help them develop their futures. So I think that's my bit, and I give you Helen Kerr.
Thank you. Am I all hooked up? You can all hear me? And can I just show you? So that was very kind. Thank you very much. I have known Esther for a really long time, and sometimes I sort of think that you're like the touchstone for all those changes in my career. So it really has changed over the years. And now, Kerr Smith is a studio in Toronto. We really spend our time, almost half of our time, thinking about the future. And the truth is, I probably always did that. I was probably always thinking about the future, because when you're a product designer, or if you're an architect, or if you're working in any realm where the output of your work kind of lives in a future tense, you have to be considering the future. So lately, we've been working on a very large collaborative project with an engineering firm and a large urban design firm, trying to think about 50 years into the future and what will our world look like in 50 years, so that we can have a better understanding of how we can make decisions today that won't be obsolete in the future. So this is a picture of 50 years ago in Toronto. And if I show you that picture, and then I show you this picture, it's not totally different, which is a little bit scary, right? A lot of the buildings are the same. There's tracks, I'll show you, I'll go backwards, the tracks on the ground. Some of the structures are the same. And the biggest difference of all is just the vehicle. And so when we think into the future, we think often in fantastical ways. And some of the changes that are coming really are fantastical. But a lot of the change is actually similar. It's what we know. So if I showed you this is the kind of projections into the future that people do. Does anybody know where that is? It's Paris. It's not the Paris that you know. But that's somebody's image of what Paris is going to become. Do we believe that? Maybe yes, maybe no. things are changing, they're changing rapidly, and the tools that we use to try and understand it really is through a human lens. So I say now, the work that I do is really about understanding humans now and into the future, because you can show both, and mostly in really complex situations. So those are basically human situations. Anytime where there's more than one human involved, you've got complexity happening. And so particularly right now, we're looking at those humans in cities and what is happening to them. We use two tools that very much come from our design toolkit. So they're not just back pocket, they're front forward tools that we use. The first one is insight, so understanding, and the second one is what is called foresight, looking into the future in a really structured way. And when you add those things together, what I think you get is the ability to have resilience. So if you're anticipating, not necessarily that that's exactly what's going to happen, but you're building your resilient strength to be able to react to whatever comes at you. And things are changing really rapidly right now. We live in highly volatile times. So the other thing that happens in highly volatile times is it's not all bad. There are lots of opportunities as well, and you can be prepared for those opportunities if you're looking into the future and you're also understanding the present. And maybe most importantly, you're able to discern opportunities for delight, and that you can actually create delight because you know where there are needs and wants and where those changes might happen. So what's insight? We think that it's a way to understand whole situations. So we work very much from a human-centered and ecosystem perspective. So we always want to look at the physical, the cognitive, the cultural, and the social needs and desires of people. And we do that in both a quantitative and a qualitative way. So we actually measure things, and then we interview people, we watch people, we try and understand what's underneath what they're doing. I'm not going to talk about this so much today. You can go and see some of our work if you want online. What I'm really going to talk to you about is foresight, the other half of the work that we do. And foresight is, it's, as I said before, it's a very structured approach to trying to anticipate what's coming. So our job is to not just fantasize about the future, not like that picture from Paris, but to actually create plausible, possible situations that's based on really rigorous background research. So we have full-time researchers in our firm, and we spend almost all day, many days, trying to gather enough information to make some really good evaluations of what might be coming. We're not in the prediction business. That's not what we do. So lots of companies do predictions or they do forecasts into the future. That's not our world. What we try and do is actually envision whole worlds so that you can test those worlds with whatever it is you're trying to create or understand. So the first part of that is you need to believe that change is possible. So when I talk about the future, often people say that'll never happen. So I always start by saying, well, let's think about what did happen so that we're prepared to imagine what could happen. So I want you to think all the way back to the year 2000. Some of you in the room, I can see that you were very young in the year 2000. But I want you just to imagine, that's only 16 years ago. It's not very long, right? But how much has changed in 16 years? So 16 years ago, no one thought that this picture was possible, right? No one imagined that Barack Obama would be a president, and nobody imagined that Beyonce was going to be singing, because she didn't look like that 16 years ago. She was just like a pop radio star, but not to the level that she is. So that's the kind of level of cultural change that we're talking about. And who thought that this was going to be the present? Nobody, right? You wouldn't have said that Donald Trump was going to be in this kind of situation. The DNA code had not been mapped. So think of all the changes in medical technology that have come from that. It wasn't mapped. Same-sex marriage was not a legal thing, right? It wasn't legal. Bill Gates was still running Microsoft. He now runs the largest philanthropic organization in the world. Nobody would have predicted that he would transfer his wealth into that role and make the change that he's making in today. There wasn't a war in Afghanistan because 9/11 hadn't happened yet. Think about that. Think about what the implications of that are. So we didn't have to do this in the airport. And so I don't know if you can see the junk in his drawers there. There's a gun in his pants. But we weren't looking for that in airports, right? And so today, the whole process that you go through to try and take a plane, which was a simple process in the past, is a complex process in the present. This is what your phone looked like. For those of you here, this is what your BlackBerry looked like, because that's how we received our email. And so why is that? That's because there wasn't an iPhone. We didn't have apps. How much of your life is app-centric? A little bit? A lot? The iPhone isn't even 10 years old. It's not 10 years old. So when I say that we're projecting 50 years into the future, we have to imagine sea change situations without being science fiction about it. That's pretty hard. So that didn't exist. Facebook didn't exist. No prime minister had a Twitter account. You went to get your entertainment at Blockbuster, not Netflix, which now has third quarter revenues $2.29 billion. How much did a house cost? $150,000 average house cost. That's house cost nationally. That's house cost in Toronto. It's probably more than that. So this is how we imagine the future. And this is how it really is, right? So those are drones that are being used in Northern Ontario to monitor traffic collisions out on roads where they can't send people out. So the fantastical view that we think of isn't really what happens, but we're not necessarily prepared to understand what might happen. So today we're going to talk specifically about what we think might happen, and then at the end you can tell me what some of your visions of the future might be. So the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. That's William Gibson, who made that comment. And so importantly, what's driving the change that we see in cities? What are the things in the present that might have impact as we go into the future? The way that we tackle that is we look for a whole series of different elements. We look for, up in the clouds, there are small signals, weak signals of change is what we call them. We try and understand how bundles of those, the patterns that those form, are bigger chunks of indicators that a change might really come true. And we see larger, under the water, the hidden stuff are the shifts, the large shifts from this to that. And all the way along, those icebergs are floating in the ocean, in drivers of change, the large, slow-moving conditions that are making fundamental change happen in cities. So this is a really huge one. This is from the Government of Ontario. You can see on the top, it shows the annual mean temperature change that's likely to happen between 1971, so that's in the past, up to 2071. Right? So that's a 100-year spread. And you can see how much of Ontario is going to be much hotter than it is now. So that's not speculative, they're working from science, and that's the projections into the future. So in the Southern Ontario region, we're looking at a 5 to 7 degree change likely. So that's not speculative anymore, that's, and it's not plotted kind of in an unknown way. It's a very projected, useful tool for us to anticipate change. Another really big change that is not uncertain at all is how old we'll all be as we move into the future. So Ontarians are aging fairly quickly, Canadians are aging pretty quickly, and how might that change totally the way that we conduct our lives as we move into the future? So imagine, if you will, that all those people who are over 80, my mother-in-law is 87, and she still drives her car every day, she's totally dependent on it, and she worries, her biggest worry is that every 2 years she has to go in and do a driver's test, and she's terrified that she's going to lose her driver's license. because she might not be able to see well enough, or she might not be able to pass the cognitive test. So what's going to happen to our city full of older people who suddenly may not be able to move around independently? How are we going to change our city? Or older people who may not be able to live independently but don't want to live in an assisted living situation. How can we rethink what the city is going to be in those conditions? We have always been, or have been for a long time, a multicultural city, province, country, and we are only becoming more so. And so how will that change us as we move forward when more people in Canada look different from one another and have different choices that they make in their lives? I love this picture. So this is immersive virtual reality using artificial intelligence as an immersive game situation. So in that hood, you can see that he's got his VR device in the front part of his hood, and he's playing a war game in space. So what's going to happen when advanced technologies become just normalized within our lives? How much of our lives are going to change? Again, that's not a maybe it's going to happen. That's a for sure it's going to happen, and it's happening at an accelerated pace. All the cities, the major cities in the world, are starting to grow, and the areas surrounding them are starting to deplete. And so what happens to the urban-rural divide as we become so heavily urbanized as opposed to distributed with suburban areas and then rural areas? There's conflict, geopolitical conflict around the world that's totally changing. So Syria is on the other side of the world, but it's affecting us here. It's here in Waterloo too. So we feel the repercussions of really intense global warfare or conflict. And then interestingly, so this is from PricewaterhouseCoopers, who have done a study on how the GDP shift is going to happen. So we think of ourselves as the wealthy, the privileged, the in charge of the world's economy. And what happens as much larger portions of the world economy are actually coming from different parts of the world? How is that going to change us and how we see our cities? So those are just background drivers that are actually going to force some of the things that are important for us to think about. What I want us to think about is how are our futures going to be different? And so how will we live in different ways in some very specific dimensions? So the first one that I'd like you to think about is how might we move in the future? Right? I don't know how many of you, I don't even drive. So like, this is a big issue for me. Congestion in Toronto right now is estimated to be $11 billion as an annual cost. That's the cost to productivity in the city just because of congestion. And so how are we going to make that change? So this is one of the suggestions that people have said. Maybe we can get people off the streets and we can get them up into the air. And so when we were all little kids, and I guess some of you were really, really little kids, we looked at the Jetsons and we thought, oh yeah, in the future people are going to have flying cars. So not so realistic, right? At the Consumer Electronics Show this year, they launched this. So this is a single person, like a manned drone that only has two functions. One is takeoff and one is landing. The rest of it is completely automated. And the intent is to put this out into our transportation network. So at first it will be a very high-end vehicle, but we don't have regulatory policies yet to deal with the kind of disruption that this is going to have on our system. Is this a car? Is this a plane? Is it a helicopter? Is it a drone? What is it and where does it belong in the infrastructure? But what we do know is that people who want to get somewhere fast are going to want another way to do that. When we have all those drones in our cities, what are we going to do with them all? So this is an artist's rendition of how one of the ways we might be able to manage all those flying drones that are going to be going around the place and have to park themselves somewhere in the city. The things that I think about all the time is what is that going to do to our daily noise level, right? And how are we going to tell people where to go? Are they going to follow up in the air on top of where the roads are now? Or is it just going to be open territory? So the technology is moving faster than our ability to kind of make rules and regulations and pathways for people to participate. This is a prototype from Shanghai, of a bus it's like an LRT that goes above the cars. And they actually put it out on the road, and then they abandoned it because nobody liked to have the bus driving on top of them. But it was a way to try and think about the level, like the tiers of congestion that are happening and basically bring the city to a standstill. And so what are the new modes of transportation that we're going to be looking at? Most of them are actually going to look like this, right? So what is this? This is an automated vehicle that was launched as a taxi service in Singapore earlier this year, and Uber has also launched one in Pittsburgh. So all those fantastical ideas actually might feel more normal than we typically think, right? So often these solutions kind of creep into our lives to the point that we don't really almost even notice them. So if you have a new car today, you might have automatic backup in your car, and or for parking. You might have side view. There's an ad on TV for a car that has side sensing in their car. So those are the beginnings of automated vehicles, right? I had a conversation with one of the lead developers at the University of Michigan who runs a whole city that is a test bed for automated vehicles. And I was asking him about the ethical issues involved in automated vehicles, and he said, quote, people who don't know worry about ethics. People who know are developing better solutions. I said, what? He said, because automated vehicles are going to be so sure and so safe, they will anticipate a problem before you get to a red light situation where you might have some potential accident, right? So his sense, and several other people who are working on far forward technology, they felt that actually it won't even be a choice. That as we progress over time and slowly start to adopt automated vehicles, that in fact they will be so much safer that you will be obligated. You won't have the choice to drive a manned vehicle in the future. So here's some of the ways that it might actually change the physical surroundings of the city. So see these two cars, and they're separated on the road by enough so that they don't whack into each other. So imagine instead that these vehicles are so precise about their movement that they're able to drive much closer to each other. And they don't need side view mirrors because there isn't somebody looking to see if there's something in the back. There's sensors all around. So you can get rid of those two. And then all of a sudden there's room for more on the street. So the notion of complete streets, where you have the ability to have a much more varied, multimodal transportation offering, is actually possible, right, as you move into the future. What does that mean? What does it mean when we say technology is so great? Like, we all want technology, and we're going to get those cars. So in order for all those vehicles to work properly, we actually need totally connected cities. We need cities that are the mechanisms for the cars to be able to both sense one another and to have traffic flow work in an automated way as well. And so all of that is great. All of that is also really expensive. There's infrastructure required for cities, and so somebody has to put it into place, right? So Google and many other big technology companies are working very, very hard to get the infrastructure in place. In New York, they've installed Wi-Fi stations all around the city. They've chosen cities around the world to make smart cities, essentially, where they're gathering data all the time. And so at the end of the day, who gets to use that information? We do, sort of. So cities are interested in it because it helps us make informed appropriate decisions about things. But companies are also very interested in the data because they can use it to further their own commercial means. So when we think about a highly efficient future, some of that is also a future where we give up as much as we get. One of the things that we give up is maybe all of our individual cars. So one of the questions around how we might move is whether automated vehicles are just going to simply replace all the cars. So you're just going to trade in the car that you've got some old junker, and you trade it in and you get a great new automated vehicle. And so what is that going to do to congestion? Nothing, because all the same number of cars are going to be on the street. A different way to look at it is maybe we replace all the fleets and we encourage people to actually use vehicles in a much more shared framework. And so that might actually begin to reduce congestion, begin to reduce greenhouse gases. But all of that also begs the question, are we going to replace all of our drivers? So being a driver is the number one job for men in North America. Bus drivers, car drivers, delivery trucks, taxi drivers, school bus drivers, all the ways that you can drive. Subway drivers, train drivers, all those people. So if you put them all together, it's the largest single profession in the States, and it's mostly men. And so what are they going to do? So the second question I want to ask you is, how might we work in that future? And that has an impact on how we build out and live in our cities. So automation and digitization are a huge element of what is transforming in the workplace. So this is, again, 50 years ago. So this is a car manufacturing plant, and I think that you can count at least 4 people working on this one car. We know this in Southern Ontario. This is kind of our life. So this is an automated assembly plant now, and I could count only 1, 2 people in that whole space that were making sure that this plant is running correctly. So that's part of the reality of the new future. And I do futures work all the time. I create scenarios. I work with all kinds of different companies and jurisdictions. And this issue is the one that people most often come to. Usually after I've done a talk, or if I'm sitting with somebody in their office, somebody will come and sit beside me really quietly and they say, "Is it true? Are all the jobs going to go?" And I say, yes, it's true. They're really going to go. But it doesn't mean that they're not going to be replaced by something else. So blue-collar jobs, for sure, are the first ones that can be replaced by some kind of automation. But white-collar jobs can also be replaced by automation. So if you know anybody who works as a lawyer, an accountant, a pharmacist, many parts of medical work, all those kinds of work actually have automated components now and more into the future of their work. And so we might say, so we're in a really creative place here, amazing creative place. I walked around before and saw some amazing work. And so you'd think that we would encourage people to make more of their creative life, because for sure that can't be automated. So I had a client who said he called creative work purple work. I said, what? So I'm calling it purple collar. So purple collar jobs maybe can't be replaced by automation, but this is a film editing system that you don't edit yourself. You tell it, you feed it your film, and you say, I'd like a dramatic edit. And it chooses by itself the most dramatic segments, the frames, and then assembles it into an edited piece of film without you. This is an artificial intelligence-driven web development tool. And so you can say, oh, well, graphic design for sure. Like, graphic designers work with computers, or really early adopters of computers. But that's not how this one works. The way that this one works is you feed it your copy and you feed it your images, and sometimes it goes and finds them. And then you say, I'd like it to be let's say dramatic, like the film before, and it generates these by itself. So it's a self-generating graphic design tool. And this one, in some ways, probably is the most scary. So AP News made a deal in May, I think, to report sports stories, and they also do, this is, it's from the market, like it's a market reporting piece, to generate all of these stories that look like they're written by humans, by computer. So you actually can't really tell. So when you're reading your sports stories in the morning, chances are that some of it, if not all of it, has been written by a computer. So it's hard to believe, right? But you can see, so there's automated parts of that. So some of the stories would be repeated, and those components, although they're woven together in a way that we can understand and read as a human, it's based on algorithms to get to that point. I find that kind of terrifying, all of it. But it doesn't mean necessarily that there are no places for humans. So one of the places for humans is working in an entirely different model. So Uber is a very different model. You work in a fractional way, small pieces of work, and you can use your own car at your own leisure. But the problem with Uber is that it means that you don't get benefits and you don't get a pension, and over time, as they cultivate areas, that the rate of pay doesn't always stay the same. And so Uber has a huge workforce now that they don't call their own workforce. I don't know if it is Waterloo an Uber city, or Cambridge an Uber city, no? So you know, for those of you that live in Toronto, you know the kind of battle that we've had. The disruption, the complete disruption of existing sectors is happening. And so it's not only Uber, there's lots of other companies that are like that too. A totally different way to think about work in the future is very self-driven work. So Etsy is now a nearly $2 billion company that serves as a platform for people to share and find markets for itself. And they actually opened a new branch where you can actually develop a small business with employees and use Etsy as your platform to get it out into the world. So maybe that's a slightly different way to think about working, that the fruits of your own labor, you can earn return on it. And then this is kind of an interesting thing. This is from McGill. It's a way for, it's a group of scientists that are doing comparative genomics, and they created a game and then put it out into the world so all kinds of non-experts could actually join in and participate in trying to decode this information, this genetic information that they're seeking to do. And so they play the game, and in playing the game, they're actually contributing to the greater understanding of science. So it's a highly collaborative and entertaining endeavor. But the important piece of that is that it's non-expert. So the role of experts is significantly changing because we have access to so much information out in the world. So all those things together mean a changed landscape for what work actually is going to be. And the reasons that we join together in cities, one of them is to conduct work. And so if you're not working in a particular place or on a particular thing, what does that mean? Well, there are jobs. So this is, does anybody know who PewDiePie is? He's one of the top, or if not the top YouTuber. Didn't know that was a job until recently. So he's only been a YouTuber for 5 years. He's made $124 million on YouTube talking about, at first he talked about the online games that he was doing. He did commentary on online games, and now has a humor site online and reaches his audience around the world. So it's an entirely different way to think about what your work might be and a different way to monetize your activity. So maybe this is the future of workplaces. Is they're maybe temporary, that you work anytime, anywhere, on anything, that you collaborate maybe with people around the world. And so what does place actually mean to you then when your work is not about only going to a single workplace? So does it mean that we're going to completely erase the complexion of the city? No. But it does mean that the way we use buildings might significantly change. Okay, another thing I think we need to think about is how might we love in the future? So I chose this picture because it shows the complexion of Canada in the future. We are increasingly brown. So people come from all over the world to Canada, and that is who we are. So we have found ways to be accommodating, but not all of the world is accepting that kind of change that's happening primarily in cities. It's happening across the country, but it's happening intensely in cities. And so there's places where there is a much higher rejection of an integrating and changing face of the country. We also have entirely new ideas about what family actually means. Some of those are actually really old, we just never talked about them, but we reconfigure our families in entirely different ways. And so sometimes we have children and sometimes we don't have children. Sometimes we have multiple relationships through our lives. And what does that mean for the kind of spaces that we're going to live? Do we need big spaces? Do we need changeable spaces over time? It matters how we understand the basic relationships of our life. And for sure, as I said before, we're going to be aging. And so how we understand the city from the perspective of an elder is an important thing for us to bear in mind. When we think about love, we usually think person to person, but maybe we also are experiencing love in a much more aggregate way, in a more collective way, that we are extending our love a little bit more to more groups of people in more different configurations than we have before. So when the recent groups of Syrian refugees came to Canada, they represented, many of them, an entirely different configuration of what a family is, and many of them had a problem finding housing in the city. Why? So a lot of them were big families, sometimes 9 or 10 kids, and housing in Toronto isn't really made for that anymore. So maybe it was in the past, but a large family doesn't fit in the housing configurations that we have. Another thing that happens is as all these people come into our reality, do we intersperse and everybody is all mixed together? Or is there a tendency for us to form enclaves of single types around the city? And very much Toronto, anyway, is a city of enclaves. And when I say enclaves, I don't only mean of poverty or of disadvantage. They're also enclaves of extreme wealth and sharing and helping, giving a boost to people who are like you also. But what does that do to our community, our sense of ourselves? When we were doing our research, we found a whole enclave in Scarborough of deaf people. And I was like, that's really weird. I wonder why that's happening. Why would there be that proportion of deaf people in one part of the city? And so as we dug deeper, we found that there were specialized services available in that place that were distinctly of value to that particular group of people. And so like people came to take advantage of those services and built community. So the good side of this is community. The bad side of this is when we're so isolated in our enclaves that we don't speak to people who are different from us. And for sure, can we do it in different size buildings? I just have to remember, this is Peter Stewart, this is his photography of Hong Kong. So tiny little apartments, but maybe that's part of the future that we're looking at too, that if we're reconfiguring in all these different ways, do we need the size? In certain examples, yes, when we have a different family configuration, and many of the times, no. Okay, last grouping. How might we consume in the future? So that pile of clothes is, that is a super big problem that we have in cities, is that we dispose of so much. We consume so much and we dispose of so much, and we haven't thought about it in a whole ecological cycle. So people don't even want our cast-off clothes anymore. So if you donate your stuff to Value Village or the Salvation Army, occasionally they can pick out pieces and resell them, but most of the goods that we throw away, nobody else wants. And even when we send it across the world at huge environmental expense, People don't want it there either because the fibers aren't good enough and the construction of the clothes was never made to last. So the environmental problems that are associated with our waste stream are really huge. All the plastics that we generate get thrown out. They don't decompose very well. We're not necessarily recycling everything, and much of it actually goes out into the oceans. And so we in cities are huge generators of waste. Food waste alone, so 220, my number exactly, but huge proportions of food waste every single day are produced in every single home all across North America. And so we have to figure out how to manage it, how not to have off-gassing from it, and how to actually use some of it to the end of its usable life rather than just disposing of it because maybe we didn't package it correctly in our fridges. Some of what people are doing as a way to mitigate some of that is to think of new ways to create food. So this is what's called schmeat. So it's not non-animal meat that's being produced at great expense, great research expense to actually produce meat that has a much lower carbon footprint than the kind of cow-based meat that we eat now. And the intent is to make it taste like a hamburger, smell like a hamburger, bleed like a hamburger, but it's not a hamburger. This is my favorite picture of the whole show. So that cockroach, they're trying to make into milk. So everybody goes, ooh. So protein is very environmentally expensive for us. We bring it into cities from long distances away, and then we process it and move it around continuously in our cities at, again, high environmental expense. So, but we need protein to live, right? So a researcher has found out that this particular kind of cockroach actually bears its young live, and in doing so has to feed them and produces a particular kind of protein that is the highest concentration of protein of any animal source there is. And they're working to make it into milk so that it would be a supplement or be able to be incorporated into food. And you think you don't eat bugs now, but you do. So your bread has an acceptable proportion of insect material in it. It's called added protein. And so it's out there already, but this is a way to overtly do that and try and rethink how all those people in the city are able to eat with less environmental expense. In a city like Detroit, and I don't know how many of you have been to Detroit lately, so it went through all of the sort of degradation and transformation to a much smaller city than it was in the past, leaving these wide open spaces. Lots of houses were burned or torn down because there were no people living in them. And the city as a whole had a very, it was like a giant food desert, not very difficult to get adequate access to healthy foods in the city. And so what they've done is they've actually turned over some of those abandoned lands or available lands and are making a whole garden city that actually has one of the largest urban agriculture situations in the whole of North America. So it's an interesting transformation of a city to be able to be self-provisioning and to feed itself in a way that is reasonable and uses land well. So there are more positive things about our consumption. So maybe we can change the way we think about how we consume energy. So again, a house in Germany looking at all of the rooftops as solar panels, able to power its entire city and then 3 times more feed it into the rest of the nearby community. So those are really positive. And then this idea, I think, that is beginning to transform, particularly for younger people. So if you're under 30, maybe you're thinking, instead of everything being permanent, that things in life could be much more temporary. And this is an example of at Burning Man, a building that, they spent 3 weeks building the building only to light it on fire and have it disappear. Because the intention is to have experiences that are in the now as opposed to always thinking about perpetuity. And there's so many ways that you can think about that too. So do I need to own everything in my life, or can I just have access to something? And so could we, rather than having the Uber version of a sharing economy, which isn't really sharing, actually have a sharing economy where we have just temporary time with whatever it is we need in the moment? Because the consumption that we continue to play up and be an important part of our life has a huge cost. So this is the huge cost. So look at all those buildings, all those cars in the street that are actually delivery trucks. And so if any of you have ever received a package at work instead of at home, that's part of what you're contributing to. I found this, again, when we were doing research, this study from McMaster on how transportation was distributed. What was in those trucks as they were moving around the city and clogging up all of our roadways? And so there's, different proportions. A lot of agricultural material is moving around the city, but the single biggest category, that giant circle, is empty. So more than 42% of the trucks that are driving around the city, clogging the city, have what's called backhaul. And so they're driving empty to the next place because they haven't been able to pick up another load of something. And so how is that changing how we can move through the city again? This is a new innovation. It's a small drone, but it's a land-based drone that rather than having the truck go all the way into the city, it can go to a depot and then send out a whole series of these small drones with your packages in them and move them to a place so that you can receive them. So there's all kinds of security concerns attached with it. So what if somebody put a bomb in there and just sent it off on its way? So they have to kind of work through the logistics of that, but this has actually been launched in the UK as a way to try and deal with the congestion. You may know, if any of you have been to London, that it had famously, they put in a congestion tax to try and reduce congestion. They had, you can be on day 1 or day 2 with your car going into the city. They ran all kinds of interventions to try and reduce the congestion in the city, but in fact, the number of personal vehicles has gone up, not down, and the congestion actually hasn't, it's almost as bad as it was before. And so any effort to try and reduce the amount of movement is really important. So lastly, so those are just some different ways that we could be thinking about how we might live as we go forward. And the question I have for you is, so as we think about those cities in the future, do we want to have an analytic view of what a city is, where we're gathering data on a regular basis and being as efficient as possible and moving things through based on all the information that we're able to gather? Do we want to be adventurous in the way we understand cities and build for the new and have that an optimistic but sometimes detrimental to the whole view of what the city can be? Or do we want to have a poetic perspective on what the city of the future could be? I'll just leave you with 2 last pictures that sort of illustrate the differences in the ways we can have relationships and the way we understand ourselves in the city. So this is from a series of photographs, I don't know if you've seen them, by Michael Wolff, called Tokyo Compression, which I think are very beautiful. But what he did is he photographed people in their very tight, kind of touching each other progress between going from home into work. And so they're all in the subway and they're all crushed up against the glass and crushed up against one another. And so what does that say to us when you're willing to experience that closeness and that kind of giving up your own personal space, but allowing for all of your community to be able to share a resource? And by contrast, what does this say in a city? So if you're driving around one person in a car like this and taking up that amount of space and taking up that amount of resources within the city too. So 2 very different perspectives, And what do we know is going to happen? We don't know for sure that any of that is going to happen. But knowing all of that information helps us to build, as I said before, resilience and new ways of thinking about what our choices might be as we move forward in cities. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer some questions, but I will just tell you before I do that I tweet every day about signals of the future. And if you'd like to follow, you're welcome to follow along, so at Kersmith Design. And so we tweet by themes on a daily basis, one day about transportation, one day about food. And so as you are gathering all those signals, maybe you can begin to have some impressions of what the future might be too. Thank you very much.